add one more time my thanks for all of you being here. There were more than 100 people. So when you go home, you can say there were 100 Catholics who were here. And they are all now your best friends. And you can hold hands with them as we do this very, 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 very important work. Do take a look at the NERCAT agenda for 2009, especially the Commission of Inquiry. We really do want to make a difference. Doug gave us some challenges, and those are all absolutely real challenges, but I really believe the Holy Spirit is at work here. I really do. And we saw that in the act of President Obama issuing the executive order, and I think we can do it all with a fulsome and hefty agenda that we have for this year. So look forward to working with you as we do what I think is going to be a very important piece of work. I want to make sure everybody knows who the staff who are here from the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. You have, I hope, all met Heather Rice, who has done an extraordinary job of making this conference happen. But I also want to introduce you to Aisha Mahmoud and Megan Ware and Karen Botayov, who have worked hard, very hard with Heather to do this conference. So again, thank you. And I think we can do this, so thank you very much.
One of the wonderful things, there are many wonderful things and privileges that I had working for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, but one of the greatest, of course, was the wonderful colleagues that I worked with over the years, Drew Christensen being here, Steve Kalecki being here, but also colleagues like Marianne Cusimano-Love and Bill Barbieri, because by extension we had great privileges of working with many of our colleagues in Catholic universities who have helped us literally do our thinking. So let me just introduce Bill Barbieri, who's going to chair and moderate this evening's sessions. Bill is an associate professor of ethics in the School of Theology and Religious Studies, and he also directs the Peace and Justice Studies program here at the Catholic University of America. He's also an associate member of the Life Cycle Institute and a founding member of the Center for International Social Development. So he's, in terms of all of our sponsoring groups, Bill has been right at the center of this. And Bill, his chief research areas of interest academically are in comparative religious ethics and the relations between ethics and political theory. And of course, he, like many academics in his field, he's written extensively and on topics including human rights, multicultural citizenship, capital punishment, and the theory of justice. So Bill, we're grateful to you for chairing and moderating our session this evening. Welcome.
Well, first of all, let me extend my thanks to the organizers for putting on this event, also for including me in it. It will not have escaped your attention that there are only 2 panelists here, whereas 3 were advertised. I regret to announce that Josh Castile, who was scheduled to be our 3rd panelist this evening, was unable to come due to a family health emergency. I ask you to take just a moment for your prayers or well wishes and think of him this evening as he deals with a difficult situation. I ask you, too, to take a couple of images in mind, if you will, as we start this final session. First of all, a question to you. How many of you have seen at some point the infamous, now, images from Abu Ghraib, either photos or videos? Show of hands, perhaps. Quite a few of you have. Fix one of those images in mind, if you will. We don't need a banner that says torture is wrong to see the transparent wrongness of torture when we think of that image. Now, note, if you will, a separate image, one that we draw together with the first tonight, and that would be that image up there on the wall. It's an image you can find on most of the rooms, in most of the buildings on this campus. Another image of torture and death. I call that to your attention. We'll return to that image a little bit later in the panel. The topic of our panel, I want to say just a few words about that before we turn it over to our featured speakers. The title is Responsibilities of Catholics in the Public Square, the Question of Accountability in the Use of Torture. And I want to make just an observation or two about that. I can't resist that as an ethicist, focusing for a moment on that juxtaposition of terms responsibilities and accountability. And I want to just outline a brief distinction between those terms that I think has been relevant to the discussions we've been having up to this point today, and we'll certainly be having in the remainder of the session. Mark Danner, who was mentioned in the last panel for his work most recently in publicizing the findings that were leaked of the International Commission of the Red Cross, primarily on Guantanamo, makes a statement in his writings on that topic about how, for him, the speech that President Bush gave shortly after these images of Abu Ghraib became public, where he consistently stated that the U.S. does not use torture and would not use torture. That, according to Mark Danner, he thinks will be perhaps the only truly historic speech that is a legacy of the Bush administration. Now, as a journalist, he's entitled to a bit of exaggeration, but I think he makes an important point, because that kind of statement and the picture that it gives us of, some would say, denial, some would say simply a failure of accountability at the highest levels of government, implicates a whole broader set of problems and questions that, as we've pointed out here today, run deep into our laws, our political culture, our religious traditions, and our culture generally. That comment points out for us the issue of accountability for practices that we engage in and support tacitly or not so tacitly. I want to just suggest that as we focus on the question of accountability of our response for our own implication in practices that clearly constitute torture, that we identify several different levels of accountability. We will be addressing these at different points in the panel. One, we need to look at the highest levels, at in particular our political leaders, the administration, but Congress as well. Secondly, we need to look, of course, and this has been a constant theme today too, at our educators and at the ways in which we pass on our traditions and our ways of thinking about the use of force and national security and issues like that. Third, and this will be one of our foci this evening, practitioners, military interrogators, military officers, those others charged with protecting national security. How do we address the questions of accountability at that level? Finally, of course, there are the ways in which all of us as citizens must face questions of accountability when practices like this become public. We could translate those dimensions of public accountability to the church as well. And we need to pair our reflections on accountability at those different levels in public with questions about the leadership in the church. That too has been a topic today. With Catholic educators, some of whom, quite frankly, and I won't mention any names, but my Notre Dame colleagues will know who I'm talking about, have defended versions of torture light, for example, as potentially legitimate forms of interrogation and treatment. There also remain questions about the actual teachings of the church on torture, especially when we bring the several hundred years during which the church engaged in and legitimated certain kinds of torture. It is encouraging that there have been some significant changes just in the last few years in official pronouncements on the morality of torture. Finally, again, there's this issue that came up at the end of the last session about the Catholic population in particular compared to the population at large or to the self-identifying secular population. If anybody is still interested, I do have the data from the Pew study back in 2005, which did show this propensity among Catholics to support the admissibility of torture, not across the board, but specifically in the kind of ticking bomb scenario that is sometimes used to formulate questions about torture. These are all different levels at which accountability for torture has to be addressed. And in this room a couple of years ago, we had a guest who spoke, presented an address. It was Jeremy Waldron from New York University, which he gave the title, "The Injury Done by Christian Silence." Now, I'm not going to go into or endorse his entire argument, but he sets out very nicely for us a set of questions about accountability. And I'll just I'll put these in his words. The debate about torture is focused on the ethical and legal dilemmas, real, not imaginary, facing soldiers, law enforcement officials, and intelligence operatives in relation to the actual occurrence of abusive interrogative procedures. What are these people, frequently quite young men and women, to do when they see such abuses taking place? What are they to do when they see beatings, waterboardings, dogs set upon prisoners, prisoners shackled in stressed positions, and so on? What should they do when they receive orders or directives in vague, if not explicit, terms to participate in such abuse, or to facilitate or turn a blind eye to it? What are they to do when their commanders warn them, officially or unofficially, against bringing such abuses to public attention or to that of higher authority? How should they reconcile the ethics and honor of their professions as soldiers, lawyers, doctors, chaplains, or perhaps even as spies or undercover government agents, like the one on 24, who also have their codes of conduct with what they are told are the needs of their country in a time of crisis? There are questions to be put to the church leaders in this connection. How is a Christian to think about his obligation to the powers that be in relation to the exigencies of national security? What counsel can be offered to young and frightened soldiers or national security operatives who want to do what is right, even in the midst of what they see as considerable pressure from peers and superiors to connive or participate in what might be regarded as wrong? A question of character. Finally, what we need, says Jeremy Waldron, is a sense of how to think about Abu Ghraib, how to figure out what is involved there. He asks, do the churches offer us anything to choose that is more compelling than either the few bad apples characterization of these abuses or the alternative characterization that regards this sort of depravity as inevitable when frail human beings are freed from the constraints of from the constraints that are supposed to hold them back from the abyss of horror? A very nicely formulated set of questions about accountability for us. On the separate issue, to me, of responsibility, I will just say one thing. OPT is the question of responsibility. OPT, how do we respond to other people's torture? Torture that we might not think of ourselves as directly implicated in, but that we know is going on in the world. We'll have an opportunity to hear again from some torture victims because we have a bit of extra time in our panel. But for now, I want to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, whom we are very privileged to have join us this evening. Retired U.S. Army Major General Tony Taguba served 34 years on active duty until retiring in January 2007. In many leadership and staff positions around the world, in Germany, Korea, Kuwait, and Iraq, He's a member of the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs Advisory Committee on Minority Veterans and serves as chairman of the Pan-Pacific American Leaders and Mentors Group, an advocacy group committed toward increasing and maintaining representation of Asian American military and civilian leaders in the U.S. Army. He's also an advocate and ardent supporter of veterans and their families with regard to benefits and compensation-related issues. He is originally from the Philippines, but moved to Hawaii and is a member of, I think, the new Hawaiian power elite that has also given us our current president. And, of course, he is known as the author of the so-called Taguba Report on the abuses at Abu Ghraib. He has also made headlines by, more recently, by raising the issue of war crimes prosecutions in response to that situation. Please join me in welcoming Tony Taguba.
Thanks, Bill, for that generous introduction. This actually followed my orders, so he's a good trooper, I would say. I told him about 30 seconds worth of introduction, and we'll just go on with it. You were timing me, weren't you? I was timing you. Well, since we are in a moot court, is this what it's called? I'll go ahead and present my case, and I'll pass the basket around later, see if I made any headway. Well, good evening, everyone, and I want to thank Walt Grazer and Rich Kilmer, where are you, Rich, for inviting me to this forum. It was my first time at the Catholic University of America. I used to pass it on my way to visit, when I was on active duty, the Armed Forces Retirement Home, which is across the street from you somewhere here. But in any case, as I was listening to Bill, and I was kind of struck of a time in my life as an altar boy. And I was an altar boy in Hawaii. And I had this plan, this desire, this aspiration to be a priest during my sophomore year in high school, and ready to go to Sacred Hearts Academy in Hawaii. And Father Gilbert Meyer, I still remember him, was my mentor at the time. Of course, my mom was very proud of the fact that her son is going to be Father Tony. I mean, for crying out loud. My dad being a Army sergeant at the time, POW Bataan. He suffered to that whole consequence. My mother also was 16 years old at the time during World War II when the Japanese attacked the Philippines. And she was helping Army nurses treat prisoners of war at a POW detention camp in Manila. So they would always come across it. My mother actually was the one that gave me the impression that I ought to become a priest. My dad, not exactly, not exactly. But he did say, well, if you joined the Army, you could be a chaplain. So you could kill two birds with one stone, But, well, I chose to be a soldier instead. And, of course, I've not deviated or somewhat withdrawn from my Catholic faith, given that, and I'll talk about it, about how our military, of course, are bounded on the moral and ethical considerations of our foundations of our service. I do want to recognize a dear friend sitting at the audience to my right here, who is a distinguished alumni. He didn't tell me this, of Catholic University, and that's Dr. Al Pierce up here. If you could give me a round of applause with him as well. He said he graduated in 1978. Is that right? He's such a young-looking man. Okay, all right. Good. I'm trying to prep him up because I know he's grading me on my remarks tonight. He is currently the Director of National Security Ethics and Leadership at the National Defense University at Fort McNair here in Washington, D.C. And I think it may bode well sometime when you have your next conference that perhaps you want to invite him back to talk about the strategic side of this thing called professional military ethics. Just as an aside, not to advertise, but just about every military institution that we have today, our military academies now have centers for professional military ethics. Isn't that a wonderful thing? It's a no-brainer, really, because we are trying to grow and educate our young leaders in our academies or even in our civilian universities today to think about the essentials of their own core values that starts with their families. Of course, it transcends to the military service should they join the military. So Al is here to grade me, and I'm sure I'll get some after-action report from him afterwards, if not later, over lunch maybe. I think it's time for him to pay anyway. I've been paying the lunches for a while. Good Lord. Well, I was asked to present my thoughts on ethical considerations that senior commanders undergo in the conduct of military operations, especially in gathering intelligence, you might say, or even information gained from interrogation without violating human rights. This is a huge task because sometimes we border on the aspects of our completing our mission and not drawing back to the real requirements that governs our way of conducting that mission. So let me at least set the stage on this issue, and hopefully we can follow up on some questions and answers later. I cannot underscore enough that our nation's military is a highly distinguished and unique profession whose ethical basis and moral justification is embedded in our Constitution today. To be exact, Title 10 of the United States Code. It is an institution, one of the four elements of national power, vested with a responsibility to not only defend our nation and its territories, but also given the added responsibilities to protect its value systems, our way of life, their infrastructure, and whatever the government declares as vital to this country's national interest. It is also bounded by the Constitution, required to adhere, I say that again, required to adhere to international laws, particularly the Geneva Convention. And they are also governed by the laws of land warfare. We actually have doctrine in that. And the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And more importantly, the uniformed services are expected to demonstrate unconditionally the predominant attributes of their respective services' common core values. And those are honor, integrity, courage, and selfless service. Now, for the military leader, this demands comes with the awesome responsibility, sometimes a challenge, of being entrusted with the lives of America's men and women to whom they will lead, they will train, they will equip, and they will care for, that is often extended to their families. Therein lies the principles of responsibility, accountability, and discipline. Now, these are the conditions of competent leadership and command responsibility, something that is somewhat different from most other professions. We are in an era of persistent conflict today around the world, and given the nature of the dangerous and unpredictable environment of our armed forces, to which our armed forces are operating under today, just about everything our troops, from privates to generals and admirals, are involved in, all have strategic value, not just in our country, but throughout the world, whether conducting combat operations or nation building or humanitarian assistance. And the role of combat leaders since 9/11 have broadened somewhat and even became a little bit more difficult, where they are required to become multi-skilled professionals, engaged in full spectrum operations, and subjected to being questioned on the intent or consequences of their mission, be it positive or negative. You may say it's tantamount to being looked at inside a fishbowl. Now, from sergeants to lieutenants and captains to colonels, these military leaders are trained to not only be combat leaders or war fighters, but also as persuasive communicators, skilled in statesmanship and governance while interacting with the local tribal and village leaders in helping them rebuild their communities, capable of leading large organizations, and who must understand the cultural context in the area of their operations. And this is occurring today in Iraq and Afghanistan, but not without exceptional challenges. That this is transformational in that these leaders, who are mostly in their 20s and 30s and some in their 40s, are exercising almost the same skills and authority normally vested with colonels and general officers who are more senior to them prior to 9/11. It's the way of life for these military leaders to conduct and adapt themselves in the 21st century. My son today is serving in West Baghdad. This is his second year in service, And we often talk about things that he ought to know or what he should do. But then I was really impressed by the amount of training he received on not only learning about the cultural aspects of the country to which he is going to be assigned to for this year, 1 year, but understanding what his responsibility entails of having to lead 16 soldiers and what the mission entails and how that would affect not only him, his soldiers, his unit, his family members. Of course, the single most important constant in this profession is how well can the military leader's character and commitment to service values withstand the stress of combat-related operations. I want to add to that because most of these soldiers today, and airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen and sailors are on their third and sometimes fourth tour. So it kind of weans on them because they always add or try to do some sort of a deductive reasoning that the first time I was there, I had at least a 75 or maybe 80% chance of coming back alive. Second tour, maybe 50%. Third tour, maybe 30%. And then for some reason or another, they become hardened with the condition of the fact that they may not come back alive. Of course, there's somebody else that worries about them back home. And for the most part, and I think the last figure is at least 300,000 of those who have been deployed today suffer from some form of post-traumatic stress syndrome. So it's a matter of how they can withstand the stresses of combat. But then the ethical and moral standards of the armed forces remain solidly firm. Nothing has changed. Most of my friends would say, or what you've read in the newspapers, or even as you Google them, that we have a new kind of war, it's asymmetrical, it's uncommon, or whatever the case may be. But we've never really changed our ethical or moral foundations. They remain firm today. But then the tactics and operations are being adjusted to counter the way to defeat the enemy. There's a constant balancing act for them to demonstrate, especially when faced with adversity. I've always said that when I was over there that bullets do not discriminate. They go everywhere. And that's where it matters whether your friend is next to you that's being killed or whether there was collateral damage on the civilians that are being affected by the battle. So while our troops receive extensive training to prepare them for any type of contingency operations, they are not immune or exempt from criminal acts, bad behavior, or tragedy as a result from these operations, albeit unfortunate, most unfortunate, and not tolerated or condoned by their chain of command. It is expected of the military leader to establish a positive and ethical command climate in his or her unit that is highly disciplined, trustworthy, conforming to their service core values, and compliant to the laws of armed conflict. The overarching demand placed upon these commanders is to provide a trained and ready force capable of performing any type of operations worldwide. So that said, let me cover at least one of the focal points of this panel discussion this evening, and that is the responsibility of senior military leaders when faced with policies or orders that may appear unlawful or involve in allegations that their soldiers in the conduct of their military operations violated the laws of war. The tragic events of torture and abuse of detainees at Abu Ghraib is just a microcosm of a much larger issue regarding torture and interrogation programs, which I believe, and we all know, were developed by senior officials, highly educated, highly intellect, in the executive office of the President of the United States, who also in his capacity as the Commander-in-Chief. The questionable policies that created the conditions to operationalize these policies as a matter of practice in gathering intelligence through illegal means grievously harmed the ethical and moral foundation of this nation's uniformed services, if not our country. And Abu Ghraib clearly demonstrated a systematic breakdown in leadership that stretched from the operational all the way down to the tactical levels. And I would even submit that the failure also involved senior leaders at the strategic and national levels. The involvement of contractors and other government agencies in detention operations without a clear line of supervisory or command chain further exacerbated an already tenuous and dangerous situation at the prison site. They certainly contributed in undermining the rules of war by which the U.S. forces must operate under, and they were not operating under the same rules. There were a few senior leaders in the units that we investigated who understood their role and mission, while several others deferred or deflected their responsibility, and I might even say accountability, to subordinates within their chain of command. And several mid-level leaders admitted to not having full knowledge of their task, appeared somewhat reticent, and some were even defiant. And from my observation, the command climate in the military police brigade I was tasked to investigate were detached and undisciplined, and not totally focused on mission requirements or published standards. The two most senior leaders or officers, a one-star general in charge of the military police unit responsible for detention operations, and the colonel in command of the military intelligence unit in charge of interrogation operations, simply did not coordinate their missions, nor did they complement each other's requirements, and for the most part failed to combine their efforts as a team. Simply put, there was absolute friction between the two senior commanders, which created an ambiguous set of conditions at Abu Ghraib that eventually led to torture and abuse of detainees, some of whom were later released. I believe of the 20 to 23 that were shown on the images or were listed as those who were tortured, all but one were released and not charged. Now, since there were no clear delineation or understanding on the rules regarding the treatment of detainees from their commanding officers, what subsequently occurred became what the enlisted soldiers determined to be in their best interest and protection. And that is, they subjected themselves to follow the instructions and orders from those they considered to be competent authority. Now, for the military police soldiers handling detainees, they considered the competent authority to be the military intelligence interrogators, other government agency officials, and civilian contractors. They had no trust or confidence in their own leaders. So what these soldiers needed most from their superiors is clarity in instructions and orders, to be resourced and trained properly to enable them to succeed, and to be inspired and motivated to follow the prescribed standards. In our book, in our own vernacular in the military, this is Leadership 101. Leaders who must exhibit competence and character to lead soldiers in combat. It was a personal action of a soldier, Sergeant Joseph Darby, who took responsibility in revealing the criminal acts at Abu Ghraib. I often wondered how his moral conscience must have troubled him, yet he turned in and implicated his fellow soldiers, unknowing what the consequences would entail for him and his family in the end. He was basically run out of his hometown, threatened with death threats, and I believe he is living somewhere on a witness protection program. Now, I believe this tragedy could have been prevented with a direct intervention of senior leaders on the battlefield. By this I mean a clear set of unambiguous guidance throughout the units and high-level command. And this include close and constant supervision by the same senior leaders to ensure strict compliance to the rules and to obviate any violations. Now, I recall reading an Army regulation that stated that the inhumane treatment of prisoners and civilians is prohibited and not justified by the stress of combat or with deep provocation. That regulation still exists today. There was obvious serious omission in the following this directive at Abu Ghraib. Now, Louis Sorley, a former Army officer and prolific author, once stated that, I quote, "The Army declaratory policy and ethical standards has not always matched its professional or its operational policy. Unfortunately, Abu Ghraib demonstrated that flaw." Now, did the torture memos become the catalyst for the soldiers to commit criminal acts? Did they provide the impetus to dismiss the ethical standards of the military, given the involvement of civilian officials and contractors who did not subscribe to the same high standards nor governed by the Uniform Code of Military Justice? Perhaps, and perhaps that is debatable. What is incredibly disturbing is that after some 17 high-level investigations, Army soldiers were singled out in all of the reports for the crimes committed at Abu Ghraib, despite the presence of other non-military elements and officials. with the commanding officers at the prison site. They were ultimately responsible and accountable for the acts of their troops, especially during combat operations. They have the ability, they possess the ability and moral imperative to question or ask for clarification on any guidance or orders they receive from their superiors that they think are unlawful or unsafe to their subordinates. Let me read you something that has remained with me, but rather is very inspirational. Someone from Lieutenant Colonel Tim Collins, the commander of the 1st Battalion Royal Irish Regiment, a British unit, who addressed his troops on the eve of the ground attack in Iraq on March 2003. He said, "We go to liberate and not conquer. We will not fly our flags in our country. We are entering Iraq to free a people, and the only flag which will be flown in that Asian land is their own. Show respect for them. If you harm the regiment or its history by over-enthusiasm in killing or in cowardice, know it is your family who will suffer. You will be shunned unless your conduct is of the highest, for your deeds will follow you down through history. We will bring shame on neither our uniform or our nation." I consider that as inspirational words that is filled with a sense of morality and ethical bounds. So on the heels of the aftermath at Abu Ghraib, the U.S. Army, who held itself accountable as an institution, immediately took extensive corrective actions, some 200 corrective actions, and imposed clear policies to safeguard any reoccurrences. New policies to improve training on detention operations were established. A new field manual, training manual in the handling of detainees and interrogation was published. Strict adherence to established laws, to include the Geneva Convention, were mandated, and commanders were clearly instructed to comply with all pertinent rules and regulations, especially in combat areas. And this is a sustainable training, and it's always repeated at every training venue from the classroom all the way up to the combat areas. Sadly, over 200 soldiers and officers were punished for their involvement in cases of abuse and torture against detainees. Most unfortunately, no civilian officials or contractors have yet to be punished for their involvement. So let me close with two of my favorite quotes from the Armed Forces Officer's Handbook. The first is from the 1960 edition, which states that having been specially chosen by the United States to sustain the dignity and integrity of its sovereign power, an officer is expected to maintain himself and to exert his influence, that he will be recognized as a worthy symbol of all that is best in the national character. The second is from the 2007 edition, as we improved it because of the new kind of war that we were fighting, where Dr. Pierce was personally involved in its publication, states that as a leader of character, you accept unmitigated personal responsibility and accountability to duty for your actions and those of your subordinates. Abu Ghraib is a superb case study in some of the places in our institutions today on the multitude of topics today, be it ethical and moral leadership, strategic decision-making, discussions on human rights, and of course the search for that ever elusive topic of leader accountability. The bottom line, at least for me, is that the Army took extraordinary effort to immediately correct the unfortunate consequences of Abu Ghraib and to reclaim its noble heritage. For the most part, sometimes we dabble on this topic called integrity, but then integrity has a consequence in all itself. But the Army took its effort to try and restore that within this institution. It's all about leadership, character, and values. It is truly encouraging that President Obama, as the Commander-in-Chief, took bold steps to rescind the same policies that brought about the images of Abu Ghraib. So I want to thank you again for inviting me to your wonderful institution and for allowing me to participate. God bless you. God bless the troops in harm's way, and God bless America.
Well, it's a personal pleasure to introduce our next speaker, a colleague of mine, lo these many years. Dr. Marianne Cusimano-Love's academic focus is in the areas of globalization, terrorism, security, non-state actors, and ethics in U.S. foreign policy. She has a certain amount of street cred when it comes to the military. She's taught military officers through Catholic University's Pentagon program. She has served on numerous boards and committees, including the International Policy Committee. She has advised the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops on International Affairs. She has served on the advisory board for the University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute. Also worked in the creation of a Catholic peace-building network that is now global in scope. She's also on the advisory board for the Georgetown University's Project on Globalization and Culture. She served on the Council on Foreign Relations, Terrorism, and Homeland Security Project, in which she advised Canadian, Caribbean, and U.S. government and private sector leaders on globalization, terrorism, and homeland security. If memory serves, she also had a fellowship at the Naval Academy in ethics and the military. She is a columnist for America Magazine, where she writes on ethics and public affairs. There is a piece of hers that is forthcoming called Accounting for Torture that will be getting attention very shortly. Other recent publications of hers include Beyond Sovereignty, Issues for a Global Agenda, and Morality Matters, Ethics and the War on Terror. I can't leave out the fact that she is also a well-known children's author, New York Times bestselling author. One of her books is about a cuddly little teddy bear that is stuffed with a ticking time bomb that is diffused by the love of a child. No, actually, I just made that up. Sorry about that. Please welcome Marianne Cusimano-Love.
Being the post-dinner speaker and the last speaker here after many, many hours of our conference, can I ask everybody to stand up? Okay? And this is for my benefit. I've had only 2 hours sleep. I have a teething toddler. So this is my excuse so I can do it. Okay. Thank you. I don't want any of you to be accusing us of torturing you by being in a repeated stress position for extended periods. Our topic today is accounting for torture. And I thought I'd start with, there's a number of arguments that are advanced in favor of torture or extenuated interrogation techniques, aggressive interrogation techniques, and against accountability for torture. So I wanted to just run through a couple of those arguments quickly, the arguments against accountability, and then I'll go to what my rebuttal would be. The first is an argument put forward by the Los Angeles Times editorial board, of all folks, saying basically it's just too hard. There's not the political stomach for it, it's too divisive, too time costly, and not a very good chance of getting any prosecutions, so why bother? The second is that put forward by Alberto Gonzalez, the former Attorney General, a rather self-serving argument given that he was part of the folks who might be under investigation. But he said that it would be unfair to those whose actions were justified by good intentions, the desire to protect Americans against terror. So regardless of potential laws that may have been broken, because their intention was good, that should be the literally get-out-of-jail-free card. The third argument is the most radical of the arguments, and that is that put forward by Mr. Cheney, by former Vice President Dick Cheney, as recently as this past weekend's Sunday News shows and the interviews. And he's still arguing that in a new kind of war against terrorists or suspected terrorists, the old moral and legal rules should not apply, and that even a very slight chance of high casualty attacks against Americans justify very aggressive actions to protect Americans, even if that sometimes means inflicting suffering on others, whether it's Afghans, Iraqis, detainees, or torture victims. because public officials have a moral obligation to do everything possible to zero out the risk to Americans of terrorist attacks. And he, of course, went on to proclaim the Obama administration had done poorly in its moral responsibility in protecting Americans in merely 50 days in office. So I want to rebut those arguments, and I'm going to make three arguments. The first is one about the ethics of risk. Our long-standing agreement about the ethics of risk has been perverted in fighting terrorism. Zeroing out the risk of terrorist attacks on Americans is neither possible or moral. And so I want to examine that. Secondly, morality matters. Our means of combating terror matters. Abandoning our moral and legal codes to combat terrorists, it's not just bad morality, it is bad policy. It does not work. In fighting terrorism, the U.S. is attempting to create a global international coalition around moral and legal norms that killing non-combatants through this tactic of terror is wrong. We cannot create a global norm while setting aside international law and international norms. It doesn't work, okay? So our means matter very much in this type of effort we're trying to take on. And dirty tactics not only don't work, but they undermine the U.S. strategic advantage and also the very institutions, U.S. institutions, that the war effort supposedly is trying to protect. So morality matters is that second point. And the third is I want to return to the image that Bill started us out with, and that is to ask from a particularly Catholic context, what does it mean to worship a tortured God? If we take the crucifixion of Christ seriously, what does that mean for us? And for me, it means that we must stand in solidarity with torture victims. We must recognize the fundamental dignity of all human life, even Iraqis, even Afghanis and detainees, and we must work very hard to ensure that our country never again so badly loses its moral compass. So the first point I want to talk to you about, the ethics of risk. First, the ethics of risk, and first, a story. The politics department here at Catholic University, of which I'm a part, where I teach, has off-campus graduate master's programs for military officers, formerly called the Pentagon Program, and for other government employees on Capitol Hill. So on Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, I was regular Tuesday, and that was my day for teaching at the Pentagon a class on terrorism. And as luck would have it, I was actually supposed to be there early that day at 9 a.m., the time of the attacks, for administrative purposes in the wing hit and the offices hit. My car battery died that morning, quite fortuitously, so I happened not to be in harm's way at the time of the attack. But that was not true of our Catholic University students, who were not only in the wing hit, but in the very offices that were hit. Their offices were inflamed. I am happy to report what we later learned, that they were able to miraculously escape, really just by the geography of who was on which side of the desk, which side of the water cooler, was which of their colleagues died. Our Catholic University students were able to climb out of the wreckage, leave the flaming building. As soon as they did so, many of them turned around, grabbed stretchers, and ran back into the building on fire to rescue others. And especially one student, particularly Nate Freer, stands to mind, who did that. They did the right thing in doing that, but when in talking with them later, they very much eschewed any labels of heroism or that what they did was somehow heroic. And they said that this is their training. As military especially, this is what they are trained to do. He said, I wasn't thinking about this. This was my training. To protect civilians, even if that means soldiers taking more risks upon themselves in order to protect others, to protect civilians. I want to start out with that story because I think whether it's the medical practice of triage, picking who needs attention first, who's most vulnerable, or whether it's Nate's quiet heroism on September 11th, We remark very little about those practices because we agree on them so deeply. That same principle is that one that weaves its way through Catholic social teaching about the preferential option for the poor, protecting children and the unborn, and of course Christian just war tradition concerning protecting civilians in combat. These ideas, by the way, are shared by other major religious traditions who also come to these same conclusions, that the most vulnerable must be protected first and that civilians must be protected even in war. So we share this ethic of risk, a triage ethic or a lifeboat ethic, a deeper conviction and a long-standing practice that we should first help and lessen risk for those most vulnerable and least able to help themselves. Unfortunately, we have lost sight of that ethic in this war on terror. In a quixotic and deeply flawed effort to zero out risks of terrorist attacks to Americans and to U.S. soldiers, we have increased the risks on more vulnerable people around the world, whether it's civilians in Afghanistan and Iraq or people detained in Iraqi prisons or other U.S. detention facilities. Former Vice President Cheney takes this argument a step further, arguing in favor of the so-called 1% doctrine, that even low probabilities of high casualty attacks on U.S. soldiers or citizens justifies taking dramatic actions, even actions previously deemed immoral or illegal, in order to safeguard U.S. lives, even if this puts much greater risk on the lives of lesser protected others. So even a 1% chance of a problem demands action. Also, this past week, Senate Republican Mitch McConnell makes a similar argument in a Washington Post editorial, arguing that we should keep Guantanamo open. And he says that even if one prisoner is released from Guantanamo who intends to try to attack Americans upon his release, that level of risk is unacceptable. And because no American community wants to house any potentially dangerous Gitmo prisoners in their backyard, therefore it is better to impose these risks on more vulnerable people in the Caribbean who have no say whatsoever in Guantanamo policies or U.S. policies in fighting terror. So this idea that no amount of risk to Americans from terror is acceptable, no matter how much risk, has to be shifted onto more vulnerable others. That's some very alarming math. Very alarming both morally and practically. Practically, it is impossible to zero out, to entirely eradicate the risk of terror. Terrorism is part of a risk of modern life, and there's no such thing as a risk-free life. It is impossible to enjoy the benefits of open societies, open technologies, open economies, without running some risk from people who deliberately seek to exploit those very global infrastructure for their own purposes and benefits, whether those are drug traffickers or terrorists. Americans face much greater risks from other things, not from a threat of terror. We face a much greater risk of dying in a car crash, especially in Washington traffic, for gun violence, also unfortunately, especially in Washington, or from dying from obesity-related diseases than we do from terrorist attacks. Yet we do not think, in regarding those other threats, that any actions are justified in order to zero out those much greater threats. And we don't believe that any action is justified because we understand, of course, that not all means are equal in addressing risk. Another thing we have to understand is that the greater the superiority of the U.S. military, the more likely that opponents will choose unconventional asymmetrical warfare and will challenge or target civilian critical infrastructure and civilians particularly. This is not just a playbook from Al-Qaeda. This is asymmetric warfare 101, and by the way, it's also the policy of the Chinese and the Russian governments. Should they ever find themselves in some future situation on the opposite point of view with the United States and in an adversarial relationship with the United States, they would not take on our more powerful military directly, but instead would seek out the softer civilian infrastructure and underbelly. And the Chinese Chinese are routinely trying to find out what those weaknesses are in terms of our cyber infrastructure. So we need to understand that there's no such thing as a zero-risk policy or option. Of course, policymakers should protect Americans from terrorist attacks. But what this means, as the British and others who've had to deal with terror attacks much longer and have a much longer learning curve than we have, who've been at this far longer, what they have learned is this means managing risks, not zeroing them out, and not shifting them onto others. We must not fight terror by shifting risk onto more vulnerable people, and we should not lie to the American people that it is somehow possible or desirable to have a zero risk, that this is morally acceptable or possible when it is not. So that's the first point. The second point is that morality matters in how we combat terror. In the debates that we've been looking at today and the more extensive debates about whether these moral and legal constraints apply in fighting terror, there are many false red herring arguments advanced, that this is some utterly new type of warfare, that moral and legal limitations do not apply to non-state actors, etc. These arguments are false. Terrorism and asymmetrical warfare are very old practices. We've got a lot of experience in them. And non-state actors are actually the norm in international relations. States are the newcomers. Sovereign states have only been around since 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia. We have a great deal of experience in dealing with non-state actors, and most of our moral traditions developed before there were sovereign states, so they're well capable of applying to non-state actors. The real question is not whether these traditions can be applied. It is whether we are willing to adhere to moral and legal limitations against an enemy that very deliberately violates these very traditions. And I think that's what really sticks in our craw. There's some sense that it is somehow unfair or unwise for the United States to adhere to moral and legal limitations against an enemy that deliberately violates those very codes, that we are somehow soft or offering the enemy a strategic advantage when we refuse to respond in kind against adversaries who fight dirty. But that view is mistaken. Our codes are not a hindrance, they are a help in fighting terror. Abandoning our moral and legal constraints is not just bad morality, it's bad politics, and by the way, it's exactly what terror groups are trying to provoke. Part of the terrorist group's plan, especially Al-Qaeda, who's very specific about this, is that they want to promote overreactions. They want to promote the type of violations in order to lead to kind of a false moral relativism, that we are all the same, and that their cause is just as legitimate as ours because we are engaging in the same types of heinous practices. So upholding our moral values while combating those who do not is actually quite smart and quite helpful to the overall effort. It helps to build and retain legitimacy and credibility for our cause, both at home and abroad. It helps to build and maintain alliances. It gives us access to strategic resources we would not otherwise have without international cooperation and alliances. And by the way, there is no way that the United States, even as the strongest state in the system, can fight terror alone. We need alliances. We need cooperation from others. Abiding by our moral and legal traditions help deny the terrorists recruits, credibility, legitimacy, support. It helps to dissuade and discourage their overall arguments. It also assuages negative public opinion of the United States, especially in the Arab and Muslim world, and it prevents these very self-defeating overreactions that terrorists seek to create. It also, as General Taguba has talked about, helps retain the military ethos and professionalism that is such a hallmark of U.S. armed forces and such a strength of the U.S. And it helps to construct a global prohibitionary norm against terror. So it's very wrong to think of ethics as a handcuff in fighting the war on terror. Ethics versus power politics is a false choice, and we are not forced to choose between upholding ethical norms or more pragmatically advancing U.S. power. These are actually an underutilized and very important tool in fighting terror and must be embraced as such. And we need to remember, no democracy has ever been felled by a terrorist group. So we are not in danger of being wiped off the face of the globe. We have to take a much more long-term and a much more nuanced view of how to approach this adversary. But we need to not play into their hands by creating the very self-defeating behaviors that they are working to promote. Finally, in this regard, battling terror is primarily a battle of ideas, and this is certainly a theme that you've heard from General Petraeus, from the 9/11 Commission, and others. As al-Qaeda fights for the idea that there's a bankruptcy of modern and secular Islamic states that are allied with the West, the U.S. also fights for the idea that this tactic of terror, of intentionally killing civilians, is wrong and impermissible. And again, we cannot fight for this moral norm while disregarding our own norms. It does not work. We certainly cannot do that in a 24/7 information age with the world watching, when anyone who has a cell phone is a reporter, and those pictures are instantly and immediately available online and everywhere. So we have to pay close attention, especially when we're fighting an adversary who does not respect these norms, that we are more vigilant in retaining them. The third point I want to raise is from a particularly Catholic perspective. What does it mean to worship a tortured God? I think we often don't think of the crucifixion in the context of torture, but Christ was tortured in what we would today call violations of the Geneva Conventions and the Torture Conventions. Christ was falsely imprisoned under the belief that he was a subversive bent on dethroning the reigning Roman and Jewish authorities of his day. And God chose not to become just any person, but to become specifically this person who was methodically tortured by the authorities of his day. His clothing was stripped, he was beaten by guards, he was softened up to try to make him talk, to renounce his plans or expose his plans of supposed revolution. He was bloodied, humiliated, and forced into excruciating stress positions, not by chains, but by the wood of the cross. Many of the methods used to torture Jesus were also used by U.S. forces in Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq and military bases in Guantanamo in Afghanistan. And it's also important to remember that as Christ hung suspended from the cross, dying, he talked with other victims, with others who were being crucified with him, about their entry into heaven. A very dramatic lesson for us today about the fundamental dignity of all human life, even criminals. The fact that we Catholics worship a tortured God is not an academic point. Many other Christian sects do not use images of the crucifix, the tortured God, as they feel that this memorializes the wrong aspect, that this memorializes Christ's suffering and death rather than his resurrection. My Catholic University students and I were repeatedly questioned about this in service trips, civil rights class service trips down to Alabama in the South by Baptists. We were down there to rebuild some burned African American churches, and they asked us why we carried this symbol around. And I was told that displaying a crucifix is like wearing an electric chair around your neck. I was told by one preacher. So it was very foreign to some folks that we would have this image of a tortured God. It was not something that all folks look at or would understand. For me, the bottom line is being disciples of a tortured God means we must never be torturers. We must see in the very image of Christ, in the very person of our own God, our solidarity with the powerless around the world, with victims of torture. We must see the fundamental dignity of human life, the face of God, even in suspected enemies, and we must treat them always accordingly. We remember this it's at Sunday Mass. We remember this in Lent in the Stations of the Cross, but we seem to forget it in the public sphere. General Taguba, in his very courageous report, brought through exactly the circumstances of Abu Ghraib and noted this was not the actions of a few bad apples, but was a larger problem that we needed to face. And certainly, more has been discussed today about how these procedures were written and approved by higher levels of the administration in a very irregular process that notedly avoided the signatures on these memos of military JAG lawyers who were against such methods as violations of the Geneva Conventions and the Military Code of Justice. So those folks were against this, and until the Bush administration, soldiers who were caught waterboarding, for example, were court-martialed. So this idea that we can't understand, we're not sure if waterboarding is torture, is a deliberate forgetting of our own legal and military law and history. So we've discussed today the victory that we've had with President Obama coming in and signing this executive order to stop these practices, to close Guantanamo over time, to return to the previous U.S. practices of abiding by the Geneva and torture conventions and our own penal codes. And of course, that's very heartening. But as Rich Kelmer and others have told us, the work isn't done. We have to ask, is that enough? With an agenda already crowded by economic meltdown and 2 wars, there is little appetite, understandably, by many in the Obama administration for looking backwards. But we may have to. U.S. and international laws mandate ethical treatment of prisoners and prohibit torture and commit us to investigate and prosecute violations. Senior U.S. officials have already admitted the practice of torture. Susan J. Crawford, the Bush administration Defense Department official who was in charge of military commissions at Guantanamo, has said that the United States tortured at Guantanamo. She released a case last year because the subject had been tortured. We've heard already about the International Committee of the Red Cross and their report. So we already have official pronouncements that this happened. We can stop having the debate about whether this constituted torture. Instead, we have to look at, if we do not pursue an investigation in the United States, others will. And guess what? It has already started. The United Nations has appointed 2 special United Nations rapporteurs, the representatives on torture and the representatives on human rights and the war on counterterrorism. And they announced last week they are beginning an investigation into the secret detention centers used by the CIA in counterterrorism efforts. Additionally, there is no reason to believe the International Criminal Court would not pursue an investigation, especially when you see they've already indicted a sitting president, existing president in Sudan. I don't think they would have a great deal of concern about former officials. So there are practical reasons for an investigation to restore U.S. legitimacy, credibility, and reputation internationally, to rebuild the military's institutional reputation and functioning, and most importantly, to understand how the law was perverted and ignored to prevent its ever happening again. But there's an additional reason, and that comes from the experiences of Catholic peace builders around the world and others. There are practical reasons to investigate the truth and to pursue accountability. When wars end, how do you pursue a sustainable peace and ensure that conflicts do not reignite? One very important way is by pursuing reconciliation among societal groups. Now, for Catholics, the term reconciliation often conjures a sacrament of penance and personal religious beliefs. But the term, when used by peace builders, is talking about reconciliation at all societal levels and by political institutions. This is a political act, not merely a personal act of conscience. There are many ways to pursue reconciliation. Truth-telling, Daniel Philpott, Robert Schreiter, and others have written extensively on this. Apology, punishment, reparations, forgiveness, acknowledgement of what happened. So there are many avenues to do that, but we can be sure that there will be no sustainable peace in Iraq or Afghanistan without pursuing policies directed toward reconciliation. And when we talk about reconciliation in terms of these countries, we're often focused on reconciliation among the various conflicting sects, for example, in Iraq. But we also must be pursuing reconciliation between Americans and Iraqis. So pursuing investigations and accountability is part of the hard, yes, it will be hard, but necessary work of building a last and just peace. So thank you for your time.
Thanks to both of our panelists. We do have a good bit of time for questions, answers, discussion, but I did say that I would recognize members of TASC. We do have some victims, some survivors of torture with us, and since we had a bit of extra time on the panel, I asked for some reflections. Any takers? Thank you. Yeah, please come on up. We're pleased to have you.
There you go. I'm nervous. Thank you for having me, and it's a great it's my honor to be here and to tell what happened in our office and what happened in our country. And, I'm from the Torture Abolition Survivor Support Coalition, TASC International, the only organization founded by survivors of torture and giving services for other survivors of torture. The founder of our organization is Sister Diana Ortiz, an American citizen born and grown up in this country, went to Guatemala to teach the Mayan children and end up being raped and tortured. Here, thank you for Bill, and he said I can do a little brief about the accountability project that we are having in our office. There is one thing which I would like to say. There is one constitution for this country, and there is, I believe, one law to apply for every one of us, not for a disadvantage or for a poor, and one for the powerful. So we at TASC is demanding if there is a violation of the United States law or if there is a violation of the international law, applying the law basically for torturing innocent peoples, torturing citizens like us, I think the law has to apply equally for every one of us. There is no two laws for a single country. We at TASC is demanding, we demand, and we're really desperate to have is someone to be accountable, the higher officials during the Bush administration. If there is a law which has been broken, if someone is ordering torture, so that has to be investigated. If warranted, they have to be prosecuted. We are not asking revenge, but we want to show for the rest of the world that this nation is a great nation, that even if you are powerful, even if you are a president of this wonderful nation, you have to be presented to the court because you did wrong. So there are peoples who demand this. We at TASC, 172 peaceful organizations, have signed to our call to support us, to ask accountability, not as Senator Leahy mentioned, to bring together a truth commission and to forget the previous one. But what we want is to investigate. We are demanding the Attorney General to form a council and to investigate what happened in the past. so that if someone is responsible for that, to see that person to be accountable. So 2,600 professors and lawyers in different universities have signed and already backed us to go further, to work with us, so that to see someone to be accountable. I don't want to see my children or my grandchildren in the future to say that, where were you when this law was applied? Where was your contribution? Have you been a bystander? I don't want to be seen like that. I don't want to see torture to happen again. That's why this June 26, 2009, we call torture never again is going to be our theme. Now, we appreciate the Obama's administration first move towards the end the practice of torture, but that's not enough. We need to see the implementation of this law. It's not only a word that we are expecting from presidents, but we need actions. We need to see where was in the first place the black sites were, and who were there in the first place. We need to see, as a citizen of this nation, we need to see the report to come out and to show that, to evidences for the people. But at the end, task demand is, if not these things proceed, and if not the United States people get together and demand this justice and not to be implemented, our task is going to present our program to the international community to say that a simple and very small organization here in Washington, D.C. are working very hard for the last 12 years to end the practice of torture and to bring those who are ordering torture in the first place. But we couldn't get any answer. So we are going to forward to other nations if they take the case towards. So if they take the cases further. So we are not stopping here. We will bring the case to International Criminal Court. So as my sister said, the Sudanese president, he's empowered yet. He has a warranty. But why not the previous governments, the Bush administration, who ordered torture? And that needs to be raised as well. So thank you very much. If you have a question, I can answer.
Thanks very much. The floor is open for questions, responses to any of the presenters. Yes, and back, all the way in back. Mm-hmm.
Accommodation and correct, because you really were one among all too few who took a principled stand in the last however many years. And former Vice President Dick Cheney, as you pointed out, Professor Love, stuck to his story this last Sunday, and he's sticking to it. I think it's our obligation to afford him the opportunity to tell his story to a judge. So. And then you spoke a little bit about this leak of the ICR report, the IRC report. We now know, still anonymous, Watchdog has leaked this report. I don't know if this is now the smoking gun, but I don't think it's any longer debatable that responsibility for torture and the use of torture in the so-called global war on terror goes right to the White House, to the White House. So, General Taguba, I'm interested if you would address that. Can we at this point say that it is in fact still debatable that accountability, responsibility goes right into the upper echelon of the Bush administration. And if the two professors would address that after the general.
I'm going to press this button here. Can you
Yes,
hear me?
already.
Okay. Up until that time when we conducted the investigation, just to kind of preface the length of our investigation was 30 days. We were given 30 days to conduct the investigation, which in our estimate was not long enough to conduct it. But there were 20 of us that somehow that's basically conducted it. And there were only a few that saw the pictures. There's a CD that had over 200 images in there, to include videos. And as I mentioned to senior officials, to include Rumsfeld, that he has not seen the totality of and the brutality of some of the images there. So at that point in time, what we were confined to was conducting an investigation of a unit that was confined to detention operations, and because of the nature of the guidance that I received to investigate the unit in terms of scapes and policies and discipline, we could not go above that level, that general officer level, which is a 1-star level. But we did speculate that we couldn't look anywhere downward, that we had to look somewhere upward, because there were policies that were signed by senior generals that we acquired, and we also looked at some other studies that were done by my contemporaries, in essence of what to conduct, how to conduct interrogations at Abu Ghraib, and what should the MPs do, and the like. So, the focus was upward. But then, as we all know today, the focus somewhat ended up somewhere in some other secret memos that resided in the Department of Defense and further up the chain. Soldiers don't do that unilaterally. And in the 30 days that we conducted our investigation, I had 20 brilliant people. They were not experts in the legal side of it, but they were highly trained professionals in that regard, to try and examine everything else that was presented to us. 6,000 pages worth of, and I didn't even know it was 6,000 pages for that matter, until somebody told me how tall that damn pile was, excuse me. And all we did was try to compress it into an executive summary. So as we know it today, I think a lot of the policies that culminated somewhat down to the field where policies were indeed operationalized. In other words, where the soldiers were conducting these illegal acts had to be reported up to the chain of command, to include the commander-in-chief for that matter, up to the chain, beyond Rumsfeld and into the executive offices. That was pretty much intimated to us while we're conducting that investigation. But we could not put that in our own report. It was considered as a matter of speculation. But I think, for the most part, with all of the articles that have been written, the investigations that have been done, to include the inquiry that was done, the Senate Armed Services report that was released, I believe, a couple of months ago, indicated that the responsibility and accountability for the policies, the manifestation of these policies, as horrible and despicable and unlawful as they were, emanated at the highest level.
And President Bush said this in his interview on ABC, that he personally authorized the use of these techniques. And of course, Donald Rumsfeld's signature is on the memos. I wanted to follow up, though, and ask you a question. There's a lot that's been written about your reception after this report came out by Secretary Rumsfeld and folks within both the Office of the Secretary of Defense and some of your colleagues at the Pentagon, that you became for some kind of persona non grata. And I wonder if you could discuss a little bit your reception and the reception to kind of blame the messenger when you came through with the report. And maybe has that attitude changed since then Has there been greater appreciation for the contribution you put forward now that the time has told a different story?
And then you've retired.
Yeah. Well, you know, I was somewhat surprised when I received this kind of war story, so to speak. But I was surprised to receive a phone call. I had already been deployed to Kuwait, and I was given the mission to investigate this matter. And of course, I had the 20 some odd people that helped me investigate it were concerned about their own future. In fact, they're concerned about what will happen to them if the report becomes exposed, and when will the report become a matter of record, even though it's already a matter of record. We classified it because there's some classified material there that was included in the documentation, not because we were trying to hide it. It was a matter of classification. So when I received this phone call, this anonymous phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning, that if I was the author of the report. Of course, CBS apparently leaked it. We saw it subsequently on CNN, for that matter, and everything went into a frenzy. The reception I received with Secretary Rumsfeld at the time, I believe it was 6 May of 2004, was less than cordial, you might say. And some of you have read the New Yorker report. And things in there that I told Cy Hurst was that I will give him as much as he wanted in the 11,000-word essay, but not as much. He was mocking in some instances, and all of his senior leaders were in the room and wanted to know in 15-minute or 30-minute or less what had happened. And you just can't excise a lot of the thoughts and the facts that was in the 6,000-page report. But, they were somewhat dismissive in nature, somewhat deceptive that I could feel, because I assumed that they had known what was in that report or had seen the photographs, for that matter. But they just wanted to see, why did this guy put it in the context that and put the blame on a lot of things, and also what had happened, or even expose it, for that matter. In my estimate, you know, when I'm given an order to conduct a report, or anybody else for that matter, whether it's a sergeant or a general or you know, you take that to heart and you put your integrity into that report. What I saw, my subordinates saw. What I heard, my subordinates heard. What I visited, they were with me. So there's no way I could counter what our report was to contain. Except one thing, I told them that I will be the one talking head to protect them. And I think to this day, I know Walt asked me if anything happened to them, and I can tell you outright, nothing happened to them. You know, I philosophize the fact that I was at the twilight of my dismal career anyway. So, you know, I made 2-star general. I'm not in jail. I'm not on parole or anything like that. So that's it. But I did understand the consequences of having to provide the report. Tantamount to, Mary said, of the messenger got shot several times, for that matter. Some folks thought that I was overzealous in reporting. Well, they can think what they want, but when you're facing members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, all 25 of them, it's almost tantamount to a losing proposition. If you lie, you lose, and if you tell the truth, you lose anyway. But I sleep good at night, for that matter. So.
Have you seen any change in military attitude since?
You know, Rand, somebody once asked me if anybody came to my rescue. My words. At that time, I did get notes and cards and whatever have you, but at the same time, I knew when I was told that I was being reassigned back to the Pentagon to work in the office of the Secretary of Defense. That basically crossed the T on that side of the house. I was sorely disappointed. A senator called me in the middle of the night and asked me how I felt about that, and I told him that governed by our own institution, that we serve at the pleasure of the President of the United States. We don't quibble about the assignment, we just get on with it. I was basically, you might say, even though I had a lot of friends who conveyed a lot of well wishes towards me and my family, I was also worried about my family. I did not get the resounding parade-like reception, not as if I was looking for one, but it seemed like that, I was the bearer of bad news, and that was that.
I didn't plan to come here. I didn't plan to come here, and I went to task. Fortunately, I had an opportunity to come to get these lessons, really. I was begging my torturers to kill me, and they said, no, we want you to suffer. We want you to suffer. We don't want to kill you. Well, as I told you the story of my cousin, he was a soldier. My mother sent me to school. I really am very grateful to John F. Kennedy. I am the beneficiary of his gift. He gave us, he opened a library in Addis Ababa University for us. He didn't teach me, he didn't give us the dead fish. He taught us how to catch a fish. Thank you very much. And we at the torture survivors say, torture is the moral equivalent of terrorism, and the boss should go.
Drew?
The general noted that neither the CIA people who are involved nor the contractors look right now at any kind of accountability. What are the prospects for any kind of accountability along those lines? What evidence needs to be pursued to see that there is some accountability?
Until the law was changed last year in the aftermath of the Blackwater scandals in Iraq, there was no accountability for military contractors. They were, by agreement first with the coalition provisional authorities in Iraq, not to be held accountable to Iraqi law. There was some laws on the books that were put in place after the Balkan engagements in the mid-'90s that technically they could be held accountable to military law, but no prosecutions were ever made. In talking with State Department, and that's only if it was a contractor that was a DOD contractor, in talking with State Department and other officials prior to Blackwater, they said, well, yes, we never really pursue, there's not really a legal avenue for us to pursue on contractor violations, but we would never hire them again. And in fact, that actually isn't true because the contracting process is so lengthy, the approval process so lengthy, and there's, for certain tasks, not so many folks, especially linguists in particular critical areas who can support them, that even when there are problems in the contracting process, those contracts were renewed. So that was prior to the Blackwater case, which is a military contractor that was charged with killing 17 Iraqi civilians, and the Iraqi government revoked their authority to operate in Iraq. And the U.S. Congress changed the law, saying that now contractors are not above the law and can be held liable for criminal prosecutions, both in Iraq and back in the United States. Now, that's the good news, that now it's legally possible to pursue prosecution. The bad news is it's still hard as the dickens to do that, because who's going to collect the evidence? How can you maintain a chain of evidence that would prevail in a courtroom? Is it going to prevail in Iraqi courts or in ours or whatever the foreign country is? So, yes, it is a big victory to technically now be able to prosecute, but it's still very, very difficult to do so. Much more difficult than for a soldier who's under a command unit and there's an established procedure for evidence collection and there's a bureaucratic organization on the ground to collect evidence and to be charged with that, dispensing that duty. So unfortunately, I don't think the prospects are good. Additionally, you have the problem of the McCain legislation, the so-called anti-torture and military commissions legislation, which offers immunity to those who were operating under good faith, quote, from the legal advice that they were given. Many European jurists look at that and say, boy, that was incredibly stupid to write that into law. Because the Torture Convention and others require that the country in which a violation took place first examine, do an investigation. But any other country may take up the issue if they feel the country in which the violations took place is not investigating. Well, now by law, okay, there is no legal opportunity for some folks to ever be held accountable. So that gives the onus, puts the onus on outsiders. And also, by the way, if they did nothing illegal, why did they need to be included, exculpability be included in law? So it was really an admission in law that they knew what was being done was wrong. And I can understand the impulse behind it. Was, I think, the impulse to not recreate what happened in Abu Ghraib, that only the lowest service members were those at the bottom of the totem pole who served any time. And so an impulse to want to protect those who had the least responsibility for the chain of events. But in terms of what that means internationally, if I were the lawyers to David Addington or John Yoo or Dick Cheney, I would be advising them not to travel abroad. And that's actually very serious, most especially not to travel to certain countries, not to travel to Belgium, not to travel to Spain, not to travel to areas that have a more active legal tradition regarding this. Now, for Dick Cheney, that may not be such a hardship. He's an older man with health problems. But for folks like David Addington or John Yoo, these are young lawyers. They're in their 30s, early 40s. That's a long time to live your life in a variety of jobs, and as a professional who foreign travel would be considered a normal part of your professional obligations. And I think they may, in fact, that may be maybe a quick and easy, in sense, sort of some sort of accountability, that they may be, in a sense, under a form of house arrest if they are circumscribing their foreign travels because of concern of what their legal liabilities may be outside our territory. But the contractor issue, unfortunately, we've solved on paper, but not in practice. And I don't think the prospects are particularly good. I'd like to see if you had a more hopeful assessment. That's my own.
Let me just add, in the context of Abu Ghraib, just about everybody we interviewed talked about OGAs, other government agencies, and contractors. But they never talked about their commanders. They didn't talk about the general this or captain that. They talked about, well, this guy told me that it was okay to do this. This guy told me to set the conditions for a very successful interrogation tomorrow or whenever the case may be. And I did interview two to the contractor. That was basically stretching my authority to go beyond the limits of investigating the military police, because I went and sought legal advice on
Isn't the
matters.
acronym for other governmental agencies called CIA?
Thank you for that clarification, Bill. Yes.
There were other names, but we're a mixed company, so I can't tell you. But in any case, and one was somewhat curious as to why we're conducting the investigation to begin with. He was an Iraqi American. He lived here in Fairfax County and was hired as an interpreter. And he was very cooperative in telling me who hired him to begin with and what he was doing. And the other thing is that he did not have a security clearance. He had an interim security clearance, but he was conveying to us the type of who he was accompanying with on the conduct of interrogation. So we called in his partner, because his partner was mentioned in just about all the interviews and all the documents that we saw, and described him as big, had a Fu Manchu, and his name was Steve. So, and Steve was not hard to find, because the first time I walked into the headquarters of the interrogation center, he was walking around with a sweater monogrammed Steve. And he was taller than everybody else, so I assumed that this is the guy that we were looking for. And I interviewed him, and I could almost sense that when we were doing the interview, it was a monotone of sorts. I talked in this level, not to threaten with anything else, because it was an administrative investigation. And I would quite ask him, how did he get hired? Well, he said he had certain skills. I said, what kind of skills is that? Well, that I can do interrogation. And I said, okay, what is your civilian, did he had any kind of military service? He said, yes. And he said he was a Navy reservist, U.S. Navy officer. I said, did you ever get any training on how to conduct interrogation or any familiarity with the Geneva Convention? And he said, well, not totally. And I asked him, what rank was he? And he said he was a commander. In other words, he's either a major level or a lieutenant colonel level, somewhere in the vicinity of about 13, 14 years of service. And that he has never been in this kind of a situation before. Which, in my mind, he was lying to me incessantly. But we did find him that he was somewhat culpable and responsible for providing the competent, authoritative instructions to the military police. But there was nothing we could do to him. The extraterritorial jurisdiction did not amount to anything, because in his contract, there's nothing that subscribes or prevents him or even make him compliant to the rules of law for that matter, and then the rules of engagement. His chain of command went to his boss, the contracting company, not to the military, because he's a civilian. The other government agencies replied to their federal agency, that particular chain, not to the military. But they're all in this setting, you might say. So one has to be in charge normally, right? But the sequences of events that occurred at Abu Ghraib defied all of that. They were not following rules. They're not just the basic standard operating procedure. Some of the images that some of you saw on TV, or some of the ones I saw on the CD, were being used as screensavers, for example. All that stuff but there's nothing that would hold a contractor, an OGA, let alone a CIA operative or official, to be accounted for.
One last point on the contractor. So if a complaint is raised about a particular contractor that they're involved in some type of violation, the typical response of the company is, well, we may look into it. If it's a particularly grave one, they can pull them back before there's any opportunity to arrest or establish a chain of evidence, and pull them back to the United States and either reassign them or let them go. Well, there's nothing that travels with that person that they were ever accused of a violation of any sort. There's no black mark on their record. So typically what you have is the recirculation of these folks. So maybe they stop working for one contractor and start working for another, and there's no way to even track. If these are bad apples, there's no way to even track them and to prevent them from re-entering the system.
Just a question, maybe more of a comment. One of the concerns that I have is that, as we heard earlier, the consequences of this kind of behavior, both at a personal, at a family, at a community, at a national level, the consequences States be thinking about in terms of the damage done, for example, in Iraq or Afghanistan or in other situations? I'm very anxious as we think about pulling out of Iraq in the context of a very failed economy, that we are going to feel perfectly justified in simply walking away with no sense of national accountability to the enormous long recovery and reconstruction period that's going to be necessary there. I know it's complex, and I know there are lots of other things going on, but can you say anything about what you would see as, either of you or any of you would see as a legitimate call for just restitution in this kind of a context?
Well, I know there's a couple of lawsuits that are pending in court today of those who were tortured, and they presented evidence for that. And I don't know what the process is and where they are in the steps to, in terms of the litigation piece of that. There are salacious payments that are paid to victims, for example, of collateral damage or accidental killing or whatever the case may be, or damages to their homes and property and the like. But there's this instance where you want to, especially the ones who were innocent, were tortured and released afterwards. That would be hard to say because of the number of names. Not exactly, I don't remember quite accurately, but there are at least 21 that they were tortured or abused at Abu Ghraib at the time when we conducted our investigation. Between the period of time was October to January. All but one, as I mentioned in my remark, were released. One was just a high-value detainee, a Syrian, the one that was shot. Of course, that wasn't accidental either. They were released, and I believe none could be found at that time. Two were sisters. They were categorized as prostitutes. They were shown on the images as having either be sodomized or naked. And the guards were just making a mockery out of that, the whole situation. And you would not see that on the newspapers, because that is tantamount to something that goes beyond impugning the integrity of the Muslim world. But none of them I know were never paid.
I'm really referring to the social consequences. Yes, the individuals, but much more
I'm not sure. I think one of the tasks that was provided, should we have some sort of a truth commission or a commission of some sort, looking at the aspects of reparation. What does reparation mean? And it could be money, it could be anything for that nature, it could be a public apology, it could be anything, a declaration of some sort, tantamount to what happened at atrocities at war. But I don't think any money could ever repay the humiliation that some of these innocent people received over time.
I would agree, and I think that would be a really important function of any investigation or commission, would be to address that issue, because if you look at the money spent on post-conflict reconstruction in Iraq, for example, there's any number of Inspector General reports that show how much of that has gone to fraud and abuse, has not made its way to the Iraqi people, how much of that has gone to U.S. defense contractors, has not gone to Iraqis. And when it has gone to Iraq, it's gone to the Iraqi government, which is, the second most corrupt government in the world, as rated by Transparency International. So, you could say, well, what has the U.S. government done already to address some of those issues? And unfortunately, the large dollar sums have not gone very far at all because of all those reasons.
To add, if you remember President Bush going to Jordan and apologizing to the King of Jordan for atrocities that happened in a different country. I thought it rather disingenuous that my commander-in-chief would do that.
Josh Castile might put that question in the context of his involvement with the Iraq Veterans Against the War in this country, and one of their objectives is full funding of the VA, dealing with this side of some of the fallout there. I did have another hand on this side. Yeah.
I have three technical questions. I am from El Salvador. I am a member of the task. 40 years ago, I was tortured in my country in jail, clandestine jail, for national warrant, and that was the training school of America. What is terrorism? What is the perpetrator's torture? What is victim the torture? It's a three question, only thing, please. But in my country 30 years ago, I was tortured in jail clandestine, and the administration Bush, father, and Ronald Reagan. Only three questions, please. Thank you.
If it was, what is torture?
No. What is terrorism?
What is terrorism?
Who is perpetrators? Torture?
Perpetrators.
Who is victim of torture?
And who are the victims?
Well, in terms of torture, there's a number of different international legal conventions and U.S. National law. And there's some differences among the definitions, but the main things that the definitions have in common are that it's intentional violence, intentional targeting of non-combatants, of civilians, by non-state actors. Now, this, of course, brings a lot of controversy because, by definition, governments of states cannot practice terror. They can certainly practice violations of the Geneva Conventions, war crimes, crimes against humanity, but other types of violence against civilians by the International Convention is not technically considered terrorism. That's because states write the laws, and they write laws in ways that I think favor those interpretations. But you say that just to say whether an act is technically classified as terror doesn't mean it's not also illegal or immoral, but it may just be covered under a different statute and under a different type of impermissibility.
I'll take one last question, and then we can convene, I think, more informally for that, but we need to draw to a close. Yes, sir.
General Taguba, you've made it pretty clear that you believe that the civilian leadership should be held accountable up to the highest level. I wonder if you have any thoughts, which you can say publicly in polite company, about the lawyers. Since it was largely civilian lawyers who gave the advice that put our servicemen and women in jeopardy, legally and morally. The military lawyers were pretty much frozen out of the process. But do you see a means by which, the John Hughes and David Addingtons could be held accountable for what they did?
Yeah, I suppose I could say it publicly.
Remember, you're in law school.
Right. I'm so curious even today how the Band of Five, Addington, you, Gonzalez, and the two others that I can't...
Jim
Haynes, came to a conclusion that it was okay to contradict or dismiss the notion, the lawful tenets of the Constitution, and dismiss the fact that they can just simply write a set of policies that are as horrible as they can be, and then have the military operate under those policies. It's a contradiction, and to put it mildly, the general counsels and the judge advocate generals of each of the services collectively opposed to it. That you just didn't know what the consequences would be upon discovery. Well, we know that now. And then to tell afterwards that they were acting in the best interest as expeditious as they can, without any further research nor vetting it with the other federal agencies, the State Department and the like, and say that they were acting in the best interest of our national security. 5, what about the 2.2 million in uniform today that are also acting honorably, following the orders of the president, following the tenets of the Constitution and the international law, them too acting in the interest of national security? I've yet to see all 5 of them ever got shot at, besides sniping amongst themselves verbally, in the pristine and academic setting of their offices in their home. They just didn't understand how it is to be, when they're out in combat, protecting our nation from afar and creating such a despicable set of policies that literally led us, and those who operationalized it inside the Pentagon, Haynes, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld for that matter, and saying it is legitimate. The second point is, then you have a president who signs an executive order in July of 2007 and says, I'm the authority to grant whether torture or illegitimate means of gaining intelligence should be legalized, for that matter. He's the authority. In other words, he is protecting his civilian side of the house, but in his other hat as the commander-in-chief, he's telling those troops in the battlefield to conduct themselves honorably. That seems to me very ambiguous, very ambiguous. You have young men and women that are following the rules of law. You have a policy, a stringent policy that says if you violate this law, you will be prosecuted to the full extent under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, to which they were. But then he is openly willing to protect those who are doing things illegally, for that matter. We had the opportunity to present this scenario to then Senator Obama, that when you become the commander-in-chief of this great nation, it is expected upon you to be unambiguous in your policies and your guidance, especially to those in harm's way.
Thank you. Well, let me ask one more time for your thanks for our panelists and for the organizers.
Are you still teaching those?